Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the TaxPayers Alliance.
This week, a real-life story, a true story of what seems to be an unaccountable and unreachable HMRC. It's the latest episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. It is the podcast from the TaxPayers Alliance. I'm your host, Duncan. Alongside me this week, John O'Connell, Chief Executive. Hello, John.
Hello, Duncan. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Good to see you as always.
And you.
And our guest this week is Gabrielle O'Donovan, author of Gino's Contraband, Innocent Until Proven Guilty, which is a real-life story regarding your, nightmare, actually. It's tempting to use the word journey, because that's the word a lot of people use, but you've had a nightmare at the hands of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Gabrielle, welcome.
Thank you very much, Duncan.
And thank you for finding the time to talk to us on this podcast. Now, there's a load of things we need to go through here, but first off, before we hear about your story, which people can read in its entirety in your book, Gino's Contraband, we'll give details a little bit later on of how people can pick up a copy. But your kind of background, because you're not someone who's a tried and tested campaigner, but something has happened to you in your life, which has made you write this book, and we're here talking to you about it today. So your background, where were you born?
Ireland,
Yep.
Clonmel, Tipperary.
Yep. Okay. And work-wise?
Work-wise, so in my career, a 30-year plus career, I have been a business consultant in change management,
Yep.
university lecturer abroad, and also a conference keynote speaker. So very much a corporate professional person living that life.
And I say this with respect, experienced, worldly wise, been around the block a few times,
yes.
so you know life.
Oh, yes.
I know your story. Let's share it with our listener. What happened?
So in November 2019, I received a letter that I didn't understand. I think it was from HMRC, could have been from the Border Police, and it was alien to me, this letter, and it was about contraband that had been found at Heathrow Police. So I was shocked. I went, "Whoa, what's this?" And because I had just moved into that area recently, and I was in a temporary rental address, I went, "Oh, this is somebody else's mail I've opened by accident," and I popped it back in the post. And then a few weeks later, before Christmas in 2019, I received a similar letter. And again, I was just as surprised. But the more surprising thing about this letter was that my name was on this one. It was addressed to me, but both letters referenced a Gino at Mickey National Co. Limited, who this contraband, 250,000 cigarettes had been found at Heathrow, and they were destined for Gino at Mickey National. So the way I remember it is that the first letter was not addressed to me, but the second one was.
And just to be clear, you had no idea who this Gino character is or was?
Absolutely, haven't a clue.
So you had two letters.
Yes.
The second of which was addressed to you directly.
Yes.
And the content of the letters in a bit more detail.
So the contents of the letters, as far as I remember, because I've been unable to get copies of these letters, I've asked a number of times, they were saying that contraband was found at Heathrow Airport, over 250,000 cigarettes, and that certain legislation allowed His Majesty's or Her Majesty's government at the time to pursue this case. So that was the nature of the letters. So, but if you can imagine from my perspective, it's like the MOD knocking on my door and saying, "We found a spaceship at the end of your garden and we have decided that it's your spaceship and that you're an alien."
Yeah. So you get these two letters, you're dumbfounded by the content of the letters.
Yes.
What did you do next?
So the first one, I returned it to sender. With the second one, I remember physically moving back going, "Oh, how come this one is addressed to me also?" And then when I investigated the letter, my first question in my mind was, how could it be that a letter intended for someone else is now addressed to me? Is this a scam? And then I started looking and analysing the letter for evidence of a scam, and I found typos and things that were wrong with the letter, and I mean, it is a scam. So, and in terms of somebody else's name being on it and my name on it, to me, it looked like a failed mail merge. Yes. Or a slapdash cut and paste.
Yeah,
so these letters mentally, The second one, I didn't return to sender because I was sure it was a scam, and I just dismissed them and forgot all about them for a year and a half,
Right.
until the third one came.
And the observation has to be made here, which is, I mean, understandably, because it was so outrageous what was in the letter, you go, this has got to be a scam.
Yes.
And mentally, you look for clues that it might be a scam.
Yes.
And it was full of typos.
Yes.
We know it wasn't a scam, and we'll get
Yes.
to detail in a second. But John, this is really interesting. You've got HMRC whacking out letters with either incorrect information on or actually just badly written in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, and shocking but not surprising, maybe, and I think any reasonable person would think this surely is a scam, because if it's sort of loosely related to a piece of business you had conducted or a sale you had made or these kinds of things, you kind of think, okay, maybe this has got something to do with me, but it's not correct, and you could address that properly. But this was just so wildly out of the blue, completely alien to you, and it just feels like it would be a reasonable step to say, hang on, there's some typos in this. This feels like a scam. Everybody gets scam in the post. My email inbox is flooded with phishing and all the rest of it. So setting up aggressive filters. So this stuff happens all the time in cybercrime, and these kinds of scams are really on the up. So you're right to put the guard up on that one.
So the second letter, which was addressed to you by name, had all the typos in and stuff. You'd written it off as a scam, and you'd ignored it for, what, a year and a half, did you say?
Well, I didn't hear anything for a year and a half,
Yeah.
so I just dismissed it and I got on with my life and forgot about the letters. And then a year and a half later, in the summer of 2021, I received a third letter, and I was really shocked. And I was thinking, in the recesses of my mind, I have some vague memories. I got 2 letters. There was a man at Gino at Mickey National Co. Limited. It had the hallmarks of a scam. The thing about this third letter is that it was a really long letter. I think it was something like 18 pages long. And then there were 10 other pages of supplementary information that I had to go onto the internet and find for myself.
Right.
And that letter had so many errors and typos on it.
Yeah. So what
It was overwhelming.
I can understand why it would be overwhelming, and I think our listeners would do too. What did you do when you got that third letter?
I looked at that letter and I analysed it, and I found so many errors, so many typos. And because it was such a long and complex letter, and as John said, completely everything was over my head, I didn't understand it. I thought the scamsters were trying to overwhelm me.
Yeah.
I thought that's what they were trying to do. So I ignored it. I thought it was a scam.
And the content of the letter was the same, even though there are many more pages. Basically, it was about all of these cigarettes at Heathrow.
Yes.
And you were being asked to pay the same amount of money.
So now they were asking for money. So in the first couple of letters, they weren't asking for money. But I suspected at some point they will ask for money. And now they were asking for 88,000 plus.
Right.
Huge amount of money.
Yeah. And were there details about where this money should be paid in this third letter?
No.
Okay. So there you are, and I'm trying to mentally picture how I would deal with this. You get this third letter. This one is a gigantic letter. It's got a load of stuff in there, and now you've been asked for 88 grand, but there's no other real detail in there at all. So where were you mentally at this time after this third letter?
I'm convinced it's a scam because there was a few different things going on. Number one, which is very important, I didn't know that it was inconceivable to me that a state body could send me a letter that would accuse me of crime. In my mind, that's defamation. That's slander. You can't send people letters accusing things, accusing them in the wrong. So in my simple mind, the world that I used to live in, that I understood democracy and human rights and good behaviour and being a professional person that's always held to standards, I thought this is impossible. If there was a real, if this was real, the compliance department would fish out, number one, that it's the wrong person, and they wouldn't allow a letter like this to go to a customer because they have a duty of care. And also, my online HMRC account showed no reference to Contraband and Gino at Mickey National. So in my mind, I'm a respectable professional taxpayer, a good citizen. I have good relationship with HMRC.
Yeah.
Never anything wrong. And then on the side, I'm getting these very badly written letters that are accusing me of something ridiculous and demanding a huge sum of money from me. So, and that is not on my tax account. So I felt like I was dealing with two HMRCs, the real HMRC and the false HMRC.
John, this is really interesting. I mean, your assessment so far, I'm struck by the idea that here we are on the third letter, this gigantic letter, many, many pages, and what Gabrielle, we would all have done this. You go, well, I'll go and have a look at my HMRC online account, find out what's going in there, and there's nothing there, and yet you've got this whopping letter. So what is it? Is this just unprofessionalism? Is it one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing?
Seems that way, and it's it's in breach of HMRC's own charter in many, many ways. Their own charter talks about treating you fairly, being aware of your personal situation, being responsive, making things easy. None of these things were happening in this case.
No.
So the HMRC's charter has sort of no legal founding. It's more of a sort of customer service document, if anything. But at the same time, it ought to give them guiding principles on how they deal with individuals. And it doesn't seem to have been followed in this case. And I suppose more, there's that basic thing about presuming somebody is guilty rather than presuming they're innocent. And again, that is supposed to be something that they do according to their charter, under getting things right.
So I'm sitting here as a layman who's hearing, as we're all hearing from Gabrielle about her story. You've got many years' experience of HMRC. John, I'm just sitting here thinking, well, hang on a second, there's this charter that they appear not to give a blind bit of notice to. What happened next?
So having received no letters for a year and a half, and having received these letters that in my mind stinked of scam, then in that summer I received a flurry of letters. Right. I received 4 letters, one after the other, and they were from, it would transpire, they were from the caseworker.
Okay.
But they did not identify themselves as the caseworker, and they did not, I can't remember if they referenced the previous letters. Perhaps they did. I can't remember. But yes, anyway, so I received a flurry of letters, 4 letters, and the letters, the new information in the letters, apart from constantly having typos and errors, but they were also demanding another amount of money. And at the time, £44,000 plus. Now, in these letters, they did mention that if you give any information, further information, we may be able to reduce the bill.
Right.
Now, you have to understand, this is completely over my head. It's very complex. I really, really just did not understand these letters. And I thought that when they first mentioned 88,000 plus, and then they mentioned 44,000 plus, I thought they were halving the bill because I didn't respond to see if they've better chance of getting 44,000 out of me. And I can remember that summer's day when I had the letter in my hand thinking, as if 44,000, the average person, as if I can... Yes, but what I did not understand, that was a penalty being added, and that it had become 132,000.
So 88 plus 44. 132 grand you're on the hook for, but it's not you, because this still appears to be a case of mistaken identity. And I've got 2 questions here, just so everyone who's listening is clear. There's this flurry of letters, I think you said 4 of them, was over what time period?
4 months.
4 months, and this was the first time that there was a name attached to it of a caseworker, so you actually had a human being potentially to deal with.
Yes.
Right, so what happened?
I was convinced that it was a scam, so I ignored them.
And then...
So what happened after that? Well, that's when it got really interesting. I was starting emotionally to feel a bit worn out. I felt targeted by a gang because people who I spoke to about this said, oh, there's the Eastern European gang and they're operating from the South Coast so they can make a quick getaway. There was warnings in the media about HMRC scams. I was convinced I was targeted by a scam. I was starting to feel a bit worn out by the whole thing, but I'm tough and I just get on with my life and just put it to the side. And then things ramped up a level in January of 2022. I received a letter, and it was a whole different ball game. This letter was hand-delivered to my home,
Right.
which alarmed me.
Yeah.
Because I used to think, these scamsters, where are they?
Yeah.
Which part of the country are they hiding in? And now they were turning up at my front door.
Yes.
So that alarmed me. The letter was printed on fax paper.
Right.
It was signed with an X.
Okay.
I kid you not.
Yeah.
And these letters were saying that if I didn't pay the sum of money, that HMRC would take action against me.
And can I just make the observation that this latest bit of your story that
Yes.
you're telling us is actually more sinister, isn't it? Someone turning up
I
at
got
your front
frightened.
door, understandably so, and an X as opposed to anyone's signature at the end of the letter.
An X on fax paper. The letter was in a white envelope with handwriting across the front.
Wow.
It was just utterly ridiculous. So all these letters, it was just built on and confirmed to me that was a scam.
Yeah.
I went to the police.
Yeah.
I went to the police. I was scared.
Yes.
For my security, I also got security cameras at home. When I went to the police looked at the most recent letters and said, yes, this does look like a scam.
Right.
And the police did surveillance outside my home twice to try and catch who was targeting me with these letters and trying to extort a huge amount of money from me based on false claims.
And then there's a perversity here that you have a situation where the police is actually monitoring HMRC.
They're doing a sting on HMRC.
it's just nuts.
Farcical.
Could the police offer any other help at all?
So the police were very good.
Yeah.
The police were very good. Very nice, decent local coppers, came around to my home, met me face to face, gave me that psychological buffer between me and the crooks. And when they were not able to catch who was ever delivering the letters, because unfortunately, by the time they started the surveillance, the letters stopped to be hand delivering, so it was the timing didn't work. But they had passed me over to Action Fraud. Now, when they passed me over to Action Fraud, I felt abandoned. I felt I will be dealing with a system, rather than the local friendly coppers. I felt exposed, and it turned out that was the case. So with Action Fraud, they assigned a crime reference number. 6 weeks later, they sent me a letter and saying, sorry, we don't have enough to go on. And that was it. And their victim support rang me saying if they could support me. And they said, are you okay? And I said, I'm okay because I've got support. But another letter has arrived. Yeah. And this letter is threatening, I think it was this letter. That was threatening if I didn't pay, they were going to publicly name and shame me.
Right.
Now, I've actually led on GDPR in corporations. I'm a change management professional. Yeah. During the GDPR, when it was being rolled out, that was it was an extra role that I picked up with a company. So I have led on GDPR. I have never heard that HMRC can bypass data privacy and GDPR to publicly publish people's names and addresses because, as proved in my case, it exposes people to danger and to ridicule. Yes. And when I received this letter, I had Action Fraud calling me and saying, victim support, sorry you're a victim of crime, receiving this letter, which I believed was a scam letter from HMRC saying they're going to name and shame me. Yeah. So I just felt bullied and harassed, but I didn't believe it to be real. Because the police didn't believe it to be real.
Exactly.
Action Fraud didn't believe it to be real.
Yeah. So I think, John, we'll get your take on what needs to change because it will become clear to people who's listening that, well, you and I know the outcome to this, but we need to find ways of stopping this happening again so people like Gabrielle don't have the same experience. But I just want to get your take on this idea of naming and shaming. Is that something that's quite prevalent when we talk about how HMRC conduct themselves, and is it right to do so?
It wouldn't be right to do so unless they've proved that somebody's actually done something. HMRC would presumably say something like, well, in our actions, we've recovered X £100 million from people who were evading taxes. And that's fine, where real criminal activity is taking place and law breaking's happening. But to name and shame somebody at the start of a process, what they consider to be a process, does seem completely off, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And the extent to which the back and forth with HMRC, it's very difficult to get hold of somebody most of the time. As Gabrielle outlines in the book, there's several attempts at phone calls to find out, what website is this? Why is my name on it, etc., etc. But yeah, again, it's that there's these big principles at play here of assuming guilt. Of saying, you owe us money, and until you prove otherwise, we're going to assume that you're guilty, which is, again, against their own guiding principles.
Let's continue to hear your story, Gabrielle. I'm just aware that I want to spend a big chunk of our podcast and our time talking about how we can stop this kind of thing happening going forward. But let's just take us to the next step of what happened to you. So just to recap, you've been to the police. Even the police are going, this looks like a fraud. You've had a letter delivered to your house, signed by X, which is just remarkably sinister. The police are going, we think it's a fraud too. But now you're kind of feeling a little bit, not hung out to dry, but perhaps even more helpless. What happened next?
So I received this letter, anyway, saying that they were going to name and shame me. Yeah. And I felt a bit beaten up by that. I thought, what a low accusation. That was, I think it was let's say it was September of 2022. And I just ignored it and got on with my life. Obviously I'd been to the police in action fraud. And then on the 1st of December, when I got up one morning, I was getting ready for work. I was staying over in Xavier, my partner's, and getting coffee's in the kitchen, and he called me. He was upstairs on the computer, and he had done a Google search of me, because what I should mention is that a week previously I had received a malicious hate mail from a stranger accusing me of fraud. Right. And my sister had just passed away suddenly. 49 years old, lung cancer, wasn't aware. So I was in a bad way.
Of course you were.
But yeah.
So this is increased pressure, more stress. Yes. You're emotionally incredibly vulnerable for very understandable reasons. And presumably, and tell me if I got this wrong, that this piece of hate mail came from someone who found your name online because you'd been named and shamed without any proof, without any evidence.
That's right.
Shocking.
But I didn't know. Yeah. I didn't know I was on the list. Yeah. And then a week later, after receiving the malicious hate mail, Xavier found it online because he was worried about it, and I wouldn't let him respond to it. Yeah. And he said, "Oh my God, how could this be? Yeah. You're on the HMRC list as a criminal. That's why you got the hate mail." And it was terribly shocking. And because during this journey, we had come across of a number of stories where criminals were operating within HMRC, that's what we thought was happening. Okay. Yeah. They had someone on the inside, if it was real. So that was terribly distressing, because I was embarrassed. I was working in a corporation near the London Eye, and I was like, oh my God, I could lose my job, my credit rating.
Professionally, it's massively damaging, isn't it? Because depending on what you do for a living, in fact, anything that you do, it doesn't matter if you're a professional that has a profile, or if you're someone who, if you want to use it this way, has a backroom job. Potentially, that kind of stuff would damage your credit rating, I would have thought.
Everything.
Alongside your professional reputation.
Exactly. So I was terrified. Yep. I got in touch with HMRC. As John rightly said, I was sent from pillar to post. No one knew what I was talking about. Yep. They didn't know what the name and shame list was. They couldn't help me. So it was absolutely dreadful. Eventually, because I'm conscious of time, I found the details of the team who owned the name and shame list. Right. I got in touch with them. They were very good. They were very kind. They were very professional. Yeah. They were like, oh my God. And they very quickly took me off the list. They did their investigation. They came back to me with a compassionate letter of apology saying, you shouldn't have been on this list. We're sorry. A caseworker will be in touch with you. Okay. So because I was grieving and traumatized, this was Christmas of 2022, I used the first quarter of 2023 to recover. I was on a mission. I'm going to sue HMRC for defamation. After Easter of 2023, I was about to reach out to legal teams to pursue a case of defamation because the timeline was coming up. And out of the blue, one morning after Easter, I got a letter from HMRC, and my heart nearly stopped. And I went upstairs anyway, and I opened this letter. And this letter was saying that if I didn't pay £132,711.25 in 10 days or get in touch, make contact with HMRC, they would pursue me for bankruptcy.
Blimey.
So it was a bombshell.
Yeah, of course.
It was horrendous. So rather than pursuing the legal angle, then I found myself... Actually, I did then speak to a lawyer, and that was a very shocking conversation because in my mind, I was going forward with a defamation claim. But that chapter in the book I called The Law's an Ass because the solicitor was very good and very professional and I think doing the right thing by me, but said that in court a judge would expect that I should have responded to the correspondence even if it was full of typos and it stunk a scam, even if my online tax account didn't associate me with this fraud. But in short, there was it wouldn't be a good idea to go forward with a defamation claim.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and even though you had since spoken to HMRC at some point,
yes,
and said this is not me, this is not me,
and I had a letter of apology from HMRC.
Wow.
And then the solicitor also said to me, there were a few key points. The defamation case wasn't going to go ahead. I should have gotten in touch with HMRC sooner and in writing because the judge prefers written correspondence. Right. I had said, well, what about all the phone calls? Can we get recordings? And the solicitor just looked away. So I think it's quite difficult to get things from HMRC to get
even though they
recordings.
recalled every call.
Yes.
Right. Amazing.
Even though, yes.
And what we're seeing as well is that the amount demanded, in this letter corresponds exactly to the amounts that were in the original letters, which were assumed to be scams because they were so unprofessionally delivered.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I thought they had a gang member on the inside. Yeah. You know, because
so
there have been such cases. So the solicitor said to me then that having delivered the bad news that there was going to be no defamation case, unless I was hard-headed about it, and I was getting my head around that and getting my head around the solicitor said something very shocking to me, that for all intents and purposes it probably was you. Yes, because circumstantial evidence suggests that it was you because you had moved into that address.
This is just nuts.
That's what would be argued. That was very, very shocking for me. And the judge, the solicitor said, do you have any proof that it wasn't you? And I said, I can prove that I'm me.
Yeah.
How do I prove that I'm someone else?
Exactly.
And then the solicitor said to me, it's very difficult to prove a negative in court. So during that call, I got very traumatised because I thought I lived in a democracy. I thought the state would protect me. I thought I had human rights to not be named and shamed, etc. And then to find myself in this dystopian world where I was hung out to dry, even though I was innocent, and I could be bullied and harassed. And I ended up, after speaking to the solicitor and getting in touch with the caseworker, eventually when I was able to get in touch with the caseworker, because once again, I was sent from pillar to post. When I rang the number on the bankruptcy warning letter, nobody knew what I was talking about.
So this is the other thing, isn't there? Because there's this accusation that you should have done more to push back and say this is not me and put it in writing or whatever. And you've explained brilliantly why you didn't, because you thought it was a scam. And from what you said, I'd be thinking it was a scam as well. And even when you try and pick up the telephone and talk to someone to try and move things forward, get some resolution, you can't blooming well get hold of anyone.
That's right. And eventually when I did speak to the caseworker, the first thing... Okay, in the first call, the caseworker couldn't find me on the system and faffed around and then called me back. And then when the caseworker called me back the second time, the first thing they said to me was, very breezy, very chilled, well, Miss O'Donovan, if you could send in anything that will prove your innocence, we'll take it from there.
Right.
And I was absolutely shocked. Prove my innocence? I live in a democracy. That was very shocking to me.
You live in a democracy where you're guilty in the eyes of HMRC until you're proven innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and HMRC in the 2015 Finance Act accrued more powers under direct recovery of debt. So they have quite extensive powers to take money from your account until you prove your innocence to them. They've used that relatively sparingly, I suppose, and they would argue they've used it in the most serious cases whatsoever, et cetera, et cetera. But to have those rights to start with, aligned with their presumption of guilt until proven innocence in cases such as these, they're quite sinister powers that they have.
They do.
Highly sinister. Let's just get towards the end of your story, not because I want to rush you, but I'm keen to just spend a bit of time, as I said earlier, talking about what needs to change to stop this happening. So where do we find ourselves in the end?
So in the end, I was put through a traumatic psychological ordeal where I had to prove my innocence. Yep. Now remember, I was already grieving. I'd already been bullied and harassed for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And now having received an apology letter, I was now being forced to prove my innocence. So it was very traumatic, and my mental health deteriorated very quickly at that time. Yeah. I was still holding down my job. And I was facing, the solicitor said to me at the end of the call, they delivered another shocking piece of news and said, I anticipate that HMRC will take you to bankruptcy court and you will need to, they have two very serious charges against you. Right. So I was traumatised. And I should imagine literally running through your head is, I'm going to lose my home, I'm going to lose all of my assets and everything I have. My house felt like a deck of cards that was going to collapse in on me. Yeah. And then Xavier, my partner, was absolutely fantastic. And he said to me, I said, what do I do? The solicitor told me that it's very difficult to prove a negative. And he said, send in anything that proved that you thought it was a scam. So the WhatsApps from Neighbourhood Watch, the action fraud, crime reference number, the police correspondence saying, this looks like a scam. So I sent in all of that, and they really deliberated. And during their time of deliberation, my mental health I got highly anxious. Yeah. It really had an awful effect on me. But eventually they sent me a very inadequate letter. It was the caseworker saying, we're disassociating your details from this case.
Right.
Refused to answer my questions in terms of my data privacy and how could my data be removed from this. Yeah. And moving forward, just to fast track to the end, when I then submitted a subject access request in June of 24, was it? But when I submitted a subject access request, the caseworker responded and just gave me the 4 letters they sent me, but didn't send me all of the letters. So HMRC are marking their own homework. And when I went to my local MP, Daisy Cooper, and asked for a number of things, I wanted a full apology, but I only got an apology for pursuing me for bankruptcy after sending me a letter of an apology in December 22. They refused to apologise for putting me on the name and shame list. They said, we just followed our processes. Right. Now, in terms of their name and shame powers, they believe that they're entitled to do that because they reasonably suspected it to be me. Now, it's not it's like saying a 5-year-old child or your own granny because it's over my head. So they are abusing their powers. They didn't give me the full apology. They offered me this. Now this is the ISBC department who's responsible for the case of Gino's Contraband and who treated me appallingly. That very department responded on behalf of Jim Harra, who was in position at the time, and offered me a full and final compensation of £200 after everything. So it was a deliberate slap in the face. It was a lack of respect for the taxpayer. I asked for my subject access request to be honoured. I'm entitled to all that information. And their nonsense was that, oh no, we have to protect identities and we don't want to jeopardise any further investigations. Hang on a second, I'm innocent.
Yeah, it sounds like a complete fudge. And just so people listening are clear, those words, you're now disassociated with this case.
Yes.
So there appears to be no further action.
Yes.
You're not going to have to find hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we still don't know who this Gino is.
No,
either.
unfortunately.
But we know it's not you.
No, it's not me.
So, John, let's just pick this over, because I think it is. It's an alarming story. It's a harrowing story, and what you've done, Gabrielle, is explained brilliantly how close it has taken you to the edge, both mentally but also financially as well. How do we stop this stuff going on in the future? Because I think I'm right in saying there's a taxpayer bill of rights in the USA. Mm-hmm. If we had a similar thing here in the UK, would it have stopped what happened to Gabrielle?
It might help. It would clarify much more specifically the actions of the tax revenue collecting body in a given jurisdiction much more firmly than the HMRC's charter does currently. Canada has an ombudsman, which actually, as far as I understand it, has some teeth in cases like this to actually monitor and respond to cases like this when their tax collecting agency steps out of bounds. So, yes, a taxpayer bill of rights could and should be something that we explore that really codifies what our rights are as individuals, small business in particular, as well. So that might help. And then, there's classic cases of incompetence here, right? It's because it's not just, we've got the sinister side. We've also just got straight up incompetence. And people dealing with public services across the board are probably seeing this, you're supposed to have a treatment in a hospital, for instance. They're saying that the GP needs to write to you. The GP is saying they've already sent the letter. And you wonder how in 2025, how this is all still happening. Yeah. How in Gabrielle's case, when she calls up, put in Gabrielle's number, up pops the information. How is that beyond the wit of man in 2025? So broken public services is underpinning lots of this too, because this is across the board. You can't even get driving tests now. So we're seeing broken systems, public services not delivering for the vast amounts of money they receive. HMRC has something like 80,000 staff, probably slightly more. Yep. And that's testament to a very complicated tax system too, which probably sits at the top of all of this. You've got a very complicated tax system full of loopholes that people try to use and fiddle. And that means that politicians are left chasing their own tail, new laws every single year. HMRC then as the civil servants who have to enforce and enact them, not really sure what to do half the time. But that doesn't help when you're, a normal tax-paying individual business, and you just need to pick up the phone, have somebody answer it, have a quick resolution to what you're talking about. It's very, very difficult. Mm.
It is difficult, and I found your story to be shocking and actually quite upsetting because, and I say this with obviously the greatest of respect, you're quite a resilient human being.
I am.
But it almost broke you.
It did.
Listening to how you spoke and the language you've used and just seeing your emotion. What have you learned from this?
I have learned that I do not live in a genuine democracy. I have learned that the state will not protect me in cases like this. I have learned that it's a fallacy that we have human rights such as data privacy. I was very scared in December 2022 that this person who'd sent me hate mail could be hiding behind a car outside my home. They had my address. Yeah. I was really frightened. So I'm very disillusioned with our political system. I really would like to mention, I think it's, as John eloquently outlined there, it's really important that we have a taxpayer's bill of rights and a taxpayer advocate. There's a chap called Dave Chaplin who set up the Taxpayer Fairness Campaign that I'm sure you're familiar with it. And I found that the tax experts are the ones closest to all of the stories and all of the sufferings that I'm becoming aware of. I would like to add, if I may, that as my story was concluding, a dear friend of mine who was one of the few people who I trusted with the draft manuscript of the book had been deteriorating before my eyes for years. I didn't understand why. We decided we're just going to turn up and we're going to have dinner and see how my friend is. And I opened the book and she said, will you read some for me, the manuscript? And I was dying to get a bit of feedback from her. I opened the chapter, Guilty Until Proven Innocent. I mentioned the post office scandal and the loan charge scandal. And the short story was that this very reserved, private person, just broke down in tears, and it turned out, was in great despair, and turned out to be a victim of the loan charge scandal. Okay. And through the process, I learned about the loan charge scandal. Yeah. So, John, you mentioned there loopholes. Sometimes loopholes are put in place to encourage certain behaviours. Yeah. And these people are, I truly believe, the victims of mis-selling by their employers, who are avoiding payroll taxes by not paying the taxes that they should have on behalf of the employee. It turned out that she was being hounded and harassed by HMRC for over £200,000, but because she had been branded as a criminal, basically, she couldn't share her story, right, in the way that I could share my story. Yes. So she was being silenced. And also this retrospective loan charge legislation is undermining human rights again, because those poor people cannot stand up and fight their corner.
And Duncan, I know you're a champion of small business. Yeah. Think what's going to happen when the inheritance tax changes come in a couple of years on family-owned businesses and farms.
Indeed.
Yeah. Lots more people are going to be put through the ringer on this kind of stuff.
And it's sad to say, just listening to both of you talk, I can only conclude we're going to hear more and more of these stories going forward.
Yes.
As a result of a very unaccountable, uncontactable HMRC.
As I say in my book, HMRC is a monstrosity, and it's causing industrial scale damage on society.
And I think, just to close off, Duncan, I think there's other elements of the public sector that are, equally as bad in terms of performance. And what we probably want to see are much smaller teams of high performers. A lot of these organisations are bloated, far too many staff. Yeah. How they can not know what one side of the office is doing from the other is ludicrous. So wholesale changing it across the civil service as well as HMRC.
The book is available now. It's published by The Change Press. It is called Gino's Contraband. We still don't know who Gino is. Guilty Until Proven Innocent, written by Gabrielle O'Donovan, and it's worth getting hold of, because what you've done brilliantly here is it's done in a diary form, so people can actually see the process of what happened to you and see how long it's been affecting your life. Listen, thank you so much for coming in.
And it could affect anyone.
Absolutely.
It's available, may I say, it's on Amazon, any good bookstores, and also I'm just finalising the Audible. So that's good. It's got ebook, print book, and the Audible is going to be available soon.
John, thank you as well for joining us on this episode. The podcast is called A Nation of Taxpayers. Of course, it's the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. And if you'd like to comment on anything you've heard, do send us an email. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.